Mosul civilians caught in the crossfire. The U.S. investigates reports one of its airstrikes killed hundreds of people. Also on today's program, the vote of a lifetime. We ask how Turkey's nationalists will impact the upcoming referendum on presidential powers. And remembering Mandela's former advisor and fellow prisoner. South Africa mourns the loss of the anti-apartheid activist Ahmed Kathrada. I'll share what he told me in an interview after Madiba's death. I'm Imran Garda, and this is the Newsmakers. As US-led forces advance in Mosul, investigators are following closely in their wake. They're looking into allegations that hundreds of civilians have been killed in recent weeks. One particular series of US airstrikes on the densely packed city center buried dozens of people under rubble. Over the weekend, the coalition paused its offensive as the full extent of the deaths began to emerge. Rights groups say the US has violated international law by not doing enough to protect civilians. And the UN has urged coalition forces to take greater care. The Pentagon says it's examining the incident, but a top US Army general says the jury is still out, saying Daesh may have blown up the buildings. That contradicts statements from the Iraqi military, and critics of Washington's current strategy point to its history in the nation, saying that 14 years after the US invasion of Iraq, American forces are still killing Iraqi civilians. Today's Newsmakers are Mosul's victims, as we ask if the desperation to rid the city of the terror group is causing terror of its own.
They were 10, my 9 nephews and my brother. I pulled out bodies of 8 of them, and the bodies of the remaining 2 are buried in the basement under rubble.
These residents of Mosul were already in a desperate situation. And now US warplanes have made it worse.
The government instructed us to stay home and avoid displacement, so we did. When the fighting became intense, we all huddled in one room at the back of the house. But the house next door was bombed, and it collapsed on us.
One such US airstrike killed up to 200 people.
Airstrike. Okay.
The Iraqi army says it called in the strikes to target Daesh positions. But the raids have turned houses and basements into death traps for civilians who were sheltering there from the fighting. Air Wars is an advocacy group calling for accountability for civilian deaths in airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. They say conservative estimates put civilian dead in air raids by Russia and the US-led coalition at more than 1,300 since the start of this year, but it could be as many as 2,000. That's likely to rise. The UN says at least 400,000 people are still in Daesh-controlled Mosul, trapped and in increasing danger. These are some of them: women, children, and the elderly. The Iraqi army says for now it's halted its offensive to flush Daesh out of this remaining area of Mosul to allow them to escape. But Daesh's change in strategy means few will take the chance.
Daesh made a decision that they were not going to retrograde anymore, that they were going to prepare lethal engagement areas for the defense of that terrain, that they would clear out what was homes, schools, and mosques and fight from those positions and try to deny the Iraqis from advancing any further.
Airstrikes can minimize army losses and destroy militant positions. The massive number of civilian deaths may have forced the coalition to stop them for the moment. But the clock is ticking for the innocents still inside Daesh-held territory. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Lisa Grande in Erbil. She's the American Deputy Special Representative of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq. And with me here in the studio, Ur Yasin Asal. He's a security and strategy expert at Istanbul Ticaret University. Thanks both of you for joining us. Lisa, if I can begin with you, please. So I guess the casualty number much larger than the coalition would admit to, because the numbers that are coming through are absolutely staggering.
What's very clear is that the number of civilian casualties is probably higher in western Mosul than it was in eastern Mosul. Overall, for the Mosul operation as a whole, the percentage of civilian casualties as compared to military casualties is unexpectedly high. We estimate that literally half of all casualties, wounded and dead, are civilians. This is unexpected. In an urban battle of this magnitude and scale, we would expect that the percentage would be far lower. What this shows, what this underscores, is the extreme danger that civilians are in Mosul.
An Iraqi Special Forces officer, Lisa, who spoke anonymously to the New York Times, said that there'd been a noticeable relaxing of the coalition's rules of engagement since President Trump took office. Do you believe that the policy has been relaxed?
Well, we've been informed that, in fact, the very strict protocols that have been in place throughout the operation against ISIL are still in place. These protocols are used by both the coalition and the Iraqi security forces, and both the coalition and the security forces have confirmed to the United Nations that the protocols are still extant. That's our understanding. What is very clear, however, is that right now in western Mosul, civilians are in grave danger. They're at danger from artillery barrage, they're at danger from snipers, from explosive hazards, and as we've seen just last week, they're at risk from airstrikes.
Or Yasin Asal, U.S. Secretary of Defense James Mattis said, quote, "There is no military force in the world that has proven more sensitive to civilian casualties." Do you believe him?
Yes, indeed, but there is clearly seen that the problem with the grounded forces from the Mosul, the local ones, and the operation force, mostly the coalition ones. Here is it can be seen the problem is on the intelligence, firstly. And then the UN forces should coordinate all the process in the ground and in air strikes, because otherwise these numbers of civilians can be grown in this process, because the Daesh located mostly, also the Lisa says, the western side of the city, and this shows that the numbers of civilians can be grown if the operation goes still with the air strikes.
At least one senior U.S. official, Ur Yasin, plus Iraqi General Yahya Rasool, Brigadier General Yahya Rasool, have said that it's actually Daesh that's doing this and blowing up these buildings and killing civilians in order for there to be public and popular global backlash against the coalition. Is that a conspiracy theory? Is that a lie? Or is that possibly plausible?
If we go to the land and we will see the picture, we will realize the reality of what is going on in Mosul. But these are all can be in a scenario, and the land operation needs to be done with special forces. Otherwise, we cannot see in the picture very well, and these numbers of civilians can be grown, because here is clearly a problem that the intelligence or the coordination or correlation with the UN forces, ground forces, and the Iraqi forces and the air strikes in the command of the US coalition.
Lisa, is there enough room for doubt that maybe Daesh have done this?
I think it's very clear that Daesh is responsible for many, if not most, of the grave human rights violations that have taken place during the Mosul campaign. What we've seen are instances where Daesh, where ISIL will round up families, put them into vacant buildings, lock them into the basement, and then provoke an attack. This is very clear that this has happened. The people that are coming out of western Mosul report these kinds of incidents to us every single day. We also believe that Daesh is responsible for shooting directly at civilians who are trying to flee to safety. All of these constitute violations against international humanitarian law. This is why the United Nations stressed at the beginning of the campaign, has stressed throughout the campaign, and stresses most urgently now the importance of all parties doing everything they can to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and to ensure that they receive the assistance that they need and deserve.
Understood, Lisa. But when it comes to, for example, Syria, and I don't want to get involved in whataboutery here, but when it's a place like Aleppo, we ultimately hold those behind the airstrike responsible, whether it's, say, the Russians or Assad, right? And they say that those on the ground are using civilians as human shields. You're telling me here that Daesh is using civilians in Western Mosul as human shields. I'm saying, isn't the ultimate responsibility of those who have killed civilians by an airstrike those who pressed the button on the aircraft, not those on the ground? Shouldn't we be holding the coalition to account, no matter how egregious Daesh is?
The point is that under international humanitarian law, all parties to the conflict, all parties, are collectively responsible for ensuring that civilians live. Nothing is more important in conflict than upholding our obligations under international humanitarian law. That's the key point.
So is it possibly a war crime if those hundreds of civilians have been killed by a coalition airstrike when they knew that it would be densely packed with civilians?
The point is that steps have to be taken to ensure that civilians are protected. The adjudication of war crimes is an issue which is a matter for international jurists to determine. For humanitarians right now, those of us who are on the front line in Mosul, trying to ensure that people receive the assistance they need, we're calling on all parties. We're saying the most important thing as this battle goes forward is making sure that civilians have a way out. We know that civilians who stay in Mosul are in danger. We know that civilians who are trying to leave in danger. We want that to stop. We want people to cross the front line and make it to safety so that they survive, so that their families survive, so that they can continue to live.
Lisa, are these strikes that have missed their target and hit civilians, or are they strikes that have hit Daesh and taken out terrorists but have had the unfortunate consequence of what they call collateral damage? Which one of it is it?
Well, the United Nations is not present in these conflict areas, so we are not in a position to say. This is why it's so important that the parties to the conflict, the responsible parties, are undertaking investigations to find out truly what happened.
Or Yasin Asal, can this be done without airstrikes? Can you actually take out Daesh from a place like Mosul without resorting to bombing it from the sky?
And bombings not just started at this time. In June of 2016, the bombardments of the airstrikes and the resieging of Mosul has been started with the coalition forces and Iraqi army. But here is a most crucial part. Here, the coalition bodies needs to share experience with Turkey. Here we have an operation also in Elbap regards to combating with Daesh. And Turkey faced those problems on there. But on the grounded forces and the cautiously operation, Turkey enhance its skills and not make it civilian deaths. The coalition strikes, not just air strikes, doing this, but the ground will be won the war, because on the ground, on the special forces, you can win the war on the battle line, on the ground. This means not just airstrike can be won combating with Daesh, but also here we have to look the mission of the United Nations again, because on Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina, the UN made humanitarian intervention, but then changed its strategy with the George Bush leading this preemptive strike. And then the third part is the making with the air strikes from the aircraft planes and through the ground. But there is no direct fight with Daesh or those terrorist organizations on the ground. If the coalition forces made their operations with special forces, with point attacks and the
But they're saying these are pinpoint attacks. They're saying they're GPS-located missiles. They're only hitting Daesh. They're not aiming for civilians. It's unfortunate if it hits civilians, but these are pinpoint. Like, from their perspective, they're saying this is not the first time somebody's told them this, because they have directed these pinpoint attacks against Daesh, according to
they
them.
have some GPS data, but it shows that there's a problem on the ground. The men who coordinating this operation gave these coordinates to the pilots, and the currently positioning bodies from the Iraqi side, from the airstrikes bodies which are on the battleground, here is seen that there is a problem. I think the world will have to focus on this issue. Otherwise, the uprising numbers of civilians shows that the coalition is not successful to combating to Daesh.
Lisa, what are civilians to do? I know they're probably not watching this program, but if you're a civilian in Western Mosul, on the one hand, some people who have survived this terrible onslaught from all sides have been told they were actually warned to stay in Western Mosul and not to leave. So some of them stayed, and then they faced a rain of rockets and bombs. Those who have left have faced persecution and all sorts of trouble. What are civilians to do? Are they, what's the protocol for civilians if you're a civilian in Western Mosul right now? Where do you go?
When the operation to retake Mosul began, the Iraqi security forces adopted a humanitarian concept of operations, which put civilian protection at the center of their battle plan. They said that they would do everything possible to help protect civilians in their homes. But if civilians felt that they had to leave, or if the army knew that they couldn't protect them, they would then help those civilians to cross the front line to safety. In eastern Mosul, 550,000 civilians were protected in their homes. The battle in western Mosul is a different battle than the one in the east. It's much harder. It's much fiercer. Civilians are at grave risk. Civilians who stay are at risk. Civilians who flee are at risk. The army knows this, the coalition knows this, all of us know this, and this is why we are all right now working together to find the best way to protect civilians. 220,000 people have fled western Mosul. We believe, after talking with the army and talking with the Iraqi government, that as many as 250,000 more civilians may be fleeing western Mosul in the weeks ahead. We are rushing right now to ensure that camps and emergency sites are ready to receive these people. And we are discussing with the Iraqi security forces the steps that they will be taking to ensure that populations leave the city safely along humanitarian corridors and along routes that will permit them to cross the lines in dignity.
And Lisa, are you convinced by what they're telling you and what they're proposing to you that they will do to ensure that this happens and that civilians don't pay a diabolical price of defeating Daesh?
It was very clear in the case of eastern Mosul that extraordinary steps were taken to protect civilians. 550,000 civilians stayed in their homes. This was remarkable. If you look at the pattern before eastern Mosul, every time there was an attack on the city, the entire population of the city fled. In the case of eastern Mosul, the civilians were protected in their homes. They were able to stay in their homes. This is why if you go to eastern Mosul right now, you'll see that part of the city returning to normality, returning to life. There are a lot of problems in eastern Mosul, but compared to other areas that have been liberated, recovery has been far faster. In the case of western Mosul, we have confidence that the Iraqi security forces and the coalition are determined to do everything they can to make sure that civilians survive. This is the highest priority.
Lisa, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for joining us from Erbil and, of course, here in studio, Yasin Asal. It's a horrendous situation for civilians there, and it's been good to talk to you and good to try and tease out some of these issues here moving forward.
Thank you for inviting to me. Thank you.
Turkish expats in Europe are voting in a referendum that could usher in the nation's most significant change since its founding nearly a century ago. And in just 2.5 weeks, the Turkish public will follow suit, answering yes or no to adopting a presidential system. On the streets and online, campaigns are increasingly appealing to a sense of national pride. But what's the view of those who claim to love their country more than the rest? What does the Nationalist Party, the MHP, make of it? Officially, they're in full support. The leader says the constitutional changes will make Turkey stronger, safer, and more prosperous. But not all are convinced. Sandra Gutman explains.
Flags are up and canvassing has begun. Turkey's political parties are rallying voters to decide for or against a new presidential system in a referendum next month. And among the pack are the grey wolves of the nationalist MHP party, campaigning for the Yes camp.
This is quite a rare sight. Traditionally, the MHP have rallied against the ruling AK party. But these campaigners say that things have changed since the failed July 15 coup. The nationalists believe they have Turkey's best interests at heart and that a new constitution might strengthen the country as it faces multiple security threats and political divisions.
The MHP, founded in 1969 by Alparslan Türkeş, is rooted in Turkish nationalism. It's been part of coalition governments in the past, promoting a right-wing agenda. Under the current leader, Devlet Bahçeli, the MHP has long opposed the conservative AK party. Bahçeli even rallied against Recep Tayyip Erdogan in the 2015 elections and the debate around the presidential system.
Around 70% of people are against the presidential system because it's not just a political system. I think people have started waking up to it. It's clear their intentions are not good.
But later that year, an attempted coup shook the country and inspired the nationalists.
Traitors, betrayers, instruments of imperialist system targeted Turkish nation with its very own weapons.
Today, the party openly endorses a new presidential system for Turkey.
We are supporting Yes because of the failed coup. It's shown us that there are holes in Turkey's political system. We've always had crises between the Prime Minister and the President. We saw it with the last Prime Minister, Ahmed Kathrada, and President Erdogan. But the MHP is not supporting this referendum because we support Erdogan. You can't be a real political party if you just accept that Erdogan will win the next election.
But not all MHP voters are convinced. Some polls say half of Turkey's nationalist supporters plan on voting against the referendum. They say another quarter of MHP voters remain undecided.
I think there are quite a few people who are unsure, and yes, I feel the pressure because the outcome of this referendum might be decided by us young, undecided MHP voters.
I don't think Turkey's ready for a new constitutional system. This country has bigger issues, like economic and political problems, that need to be addressed first.
That sentiment has been echoed by some of the MHP's own members who've questioned the party's direction. 4 high-profile challengers have since been expelled. They say they're being silenced ahead of the vote. With the referendum proving such a tight race, will the MHP be able to rally its supporters for what it says is the good of the nation? Or will the party's divisions swing the vote? Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
South African anti-apartheid activist Ahmed Kathrada, a man who spent almost 3 decades in jail on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela, has died, aged 87. I interviewed Kathrada 2 days after Mandela died, and we discussed poverty, corruption and economic inequality in the country. He was cagey, hesitant to criticize President Jacob Zuma, choosing loyalty to the ruling party almost right to the end. But last year, he wrote an open letter to the president, imploring him to step down. It was a letter he said he had agonized over for a long time. It was this gesture, and now a request from his family, that the president not speak at Kathrada's funeral, that will reopen debate in the country. Is the Zuma administration hurting the legacy of freedom that the likes of Kathrada and Mandela fought for?
Someone has written about 2 prisoners looking out of their cell windows. The one saw iron bars, while the other saw stars. All those who were not white were treated as lesser human beings. When democracy came in 1994, for the first time in our lives, those who are not white were now regarded as equal human beings.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.